back position because it was so much further from some of those sites. But the kind of belief has followed the necessity, right? That Guam is the perfect place for military basing. And as I've been pointing out, of course, Guam's colonial status makes it possible for the U.S. to operate here and establish bases with much more freedom than it would be able to in other countries. And then the process of militarization, as I pointed out early on, has been one that leads the military basing process to have a kind of a momentum of its own, a momentum that's driven in part by those companies and others who would profit from base building and from base operations, as well as from national security doctrine about the necessity for the United States to have an imperial presence in the world, to have a forward presence and a strong and a very, very large military, larger than the militaries of every other country in the world combined. Right? That's, again, a strategic doctrine followed by funding. Right? In addition, there are many forms of resistance to U.S. basing. There are a variety of different kinds of arguments that people have used to say that the bases should not exist, or they should be smaller, or they should be more controlled by much stricter SOFAs and so on. And those arguments range from nationalism through feminism, through anti-militarism, to environmentalism, to anti-imperialism. In addition, I think, as some people have clearly been talking about on Guam, security concerns about potential targeting have also been raised in many countries. If U.S. assets are placed in that country, people are rightly concerned that they then appear on the map of the targeting map of in the Kremlin in the past, or even now, or again, of terrorists who might obviously be interested in attacking the U.S. at these locations. Okay, now I want to talk about the costs of bases and the impact of those bases. There's a whole series of impacts that you all have been talking about in community forum and amongst yourselves. Clearly, what you're asking, what is the impact of these bases going to be, the impact of the growth? And the list of potential changes is really quite long. It includes changes to your economic life, levels of inequality, increases in migration and potential kinds of ethnic conflict, higher military recruitment rates, physical environmental damage, changed gender ratio. Obviously, the military remains a predominantly male institution. The contractors who are brought in have been predominantly male construction workers. Changed gender roles as well. Increased crime rates of various kinds. Again, some of those are crime rates in the civilian community that will go up with increased poverty, as they have in Fayetteville. And some are crimes by soldiers. Increased population density, suburbanization of land use patterns, which I'll give you an example of in a minute, and various kinds of political cultural change. Military-based communities have often had a distinctive kind of local political culture, a less democratic culture in some ways, a less empowered political culture, because those communities see the imperial power, in this case the United States, as, or the federal government if it's domestic, see those Washington as having more control over their fate than their own local political leaders do, or they themselves do. That's a very common pattern. And again, you have been engaged in a several-year-long exercise of trying to imagine and detail the impact of this military base growth on Guam in order to gain some relief from the expected continued externalization of the social costs of military basing. Okay. One example of those externalized costs would be health and environmental effects. And again, with all of these FUDs and again, research very much needed on what the health impact has been of these. But also, again, the kind of the land use patterns on U.S. military posts has been very much like the mainland U.S. pattern, the post-World War II pattern of suburbanization, of sprawl, of setting up housing in a very sort of open, spread out way, rather than in urbanized forms. And as you can see, again here, sort of military housing patterns. And then also, just in terms of the boundary between the base and the community, there are more urbanized patterns at the edge, more dense patterns of land use than there are on the coast. Another example of externalized costs would be long-term maintenance of roads, like Marine Drive, which obviously has had to be repaired for all these years with local funds rather than military funds, even though some important proportion of the traffic on that road is, and some of the heaviest wear on the road is from heavy military vehicles. Okay, and in this final section, I want to discuss the economic impact of bases, and obviously the health and well-being effects of bases are more crucial, but we need to speak about the economic effects because they're the primary thing that people in many base communities are talking about, and they focus on them for we focus on them for two reasons. The military advertises those effects, focusing on the dollars brought in via soldiers' salaries, civilian work on post, and construction and other subcontracts. So the First Hawaiian Bank published a Guam economic forecast that claimed that the military expansion is anticipated to benefit Guam's economy in the amount of $1.5 billion per year once the process begins. And the second reason why we need to look at economic effects is because while the effects can be major and the effects can be major and they would appear overall to be positive, it's the main thing that people pin their hopes on. Unlike, obviously, the environmental effects, the sovereignty effects, the cultural crime and noise effects. Although, again, in any of these cases, it's a very interesting and complex question how these things work. So the environmental effects of the bases include all of those floods and the problem of toxins, but you can also see that the preservation of certain kinds of open space and green space has been much more extensive on the military posts themselves, and many people will argue that this is an argument that the military has been an environmental benefit to the island. I think one of the reasons why the economic benefits of military bases appear positive is because the powerful benefit. Those dollars do not distribute evenly, and when they then convince others that they too benefit even when they palpably do not. Moreover, the military has a large number of personnel, military and civilian, doing public relations work with the communities to make that case. This was true in Fayetteville as well. The local paper got press releases every day from the military, and particularly at least once a year there was a very large and very impressive story about these economic impacts in terms of the dollars were all added up of contracts that had come to Fort Bragg. So the Chamber of Commerce funded, your Chamber of Commerce funded an early 2008 survey that found that 71% of Guam residents supported an increase in the U.S. military presence, with nearly 80% of the view that the increasing military presence would result in additional jobs and tax revenue. According to the poll, 60% felt the additional Marines on the island would have a positive effect and would ultimately improve the island's quality of life. My question about that survey is first, what was the methodology? Because of course, we know in politics, polls are often commissioned to come up with a particular result, right? They don't always represent the best social science. So they create reality as much as reflected. Polls have notoriously this sort of interesting sociological effect that we read them in the newspaper and we say, oh, I guess I feel that way too, right? People tend to want to feel like the majority of their neighbors feel. And once the poll tells them what that majority feels, it has, again, a self-fulfilling prophecy.